The international airport terminal was a symphony of chaos, a roaring beast of echoing announcements, rolling suitcases, and 1,000 overlapping conversations. For Ilara, however, it was a silent film played at a frantic speed. She sat on a hard plastic chair, a small, worn backpack at her feet, feeling the vibrations of the hurried world through the soles of her shoes. Her heart, a nervous bird in her chest, fluttered with an anticipation that had been building for years. This flight wasn't just a trip, it was a bridge back to a life she had lost, a chance to be reunited with the family she only saw in faded photographs. She clutched a dog-eared ticket, her lifeline in this ocean of noise she couldn't hear, surrounded by people who were moving so fast they didn't truly see anyone at all. Over the cacophony, a voice crackled through the public address system, a meaningless static to Ilara's ears. At gate B12, a small crowd of people rose as one, shuffling into a line with practiced weariness. Ilara, lost in a daydream of her mother's embrace, didn't notice the subtle shift in the room's energy. Her eyes were fixed on the departures board, but the letters swam together, her anxiety making it difficult to focus. She traced the rim of a small, silver locket around her neck, a nervous habit that grounded her. The final boarding call for her flight echoed once, then twice, a desperate cry into the void of her silence. The last passenger scanned their ticket. The gate agent gave a cursory glance around the empty waiting area, and the heavy door swung shut with a quiet, decisive click. It was the stillness that finally alerted her. The bustling energy around her gate had vanished, replaced by an unnerving calm. Ilara's head snapped up, her eyes darting from the now empty seats to the closed gate door. A new flight number glowed ominously on the screen above it. A cold wave of panic washed over her, so intense it stole her breath. It couldn't be. She stood on trembling legs, her ticket crumpled in her fist, and rushed to the counter. She tried to catch the agent's eye, her hands beginning to form pleading shapes. But the woman was already focused on her computer, her expression a mask of professional indifference. Ilara's silent plea was swallowed by the terminal's relentless hum, a voiceless cry in a world that refused to listen. Not far away, a 6-year-old girl named Maya sat quietly, her small feet dangling far above the polished floor. In her lap was a brightly illustrated storybook about a constellation of lost stars searching for their way home. Her father sat beside her, a figure of modern distraction, his entire world compressed into the glowing screen of his phone. He scrolled and typed, oblivious to his daughter and to the quiet drama unfolding just a few feet away. But Maya wasn't looking at the colorful pages of her book. Her large, curious eyes were fixed on the woman with the frantic expression. She saw the tremor in the woman's hands, the desperation in her wide eyes, and the way she seemed to shrink into herself as the gate agent ignored her. A silent story of distress that was more compelling than any fairy tale. As her hope began to crumble, Ilara's instincts took over. Her hand rose to her chest, and she made a small, fluttering gesture, repeating it over and over. It wasn't a word in any known sign language. It was a secret code, a silent signal of distress her mother had taught her as a child, meant to signify a lost star looking for its light. To the preoccupied travelers rushing past, it was a meaningless, nervous twitch. But to Maya, whose book was filled with those very same lost stars, the gesture was a sudden, shocking spark of recognition. The woman's silent, desperate signal had finally pierced through the noise, seen by the one heart in the entire airport open enough to understand it. Ilara didn't know it yet, but her world was about to change because of a little girl and a storybook. The gesture resonated deep within her, a bridge between the fantasy world in her lap and the raw, unfiltered emotion she witnessed across the terminal. Her father's voice was a distant memory from earlier that day, a gentle but firm warning about talking to strangers, a rule as ingrained in her mind as looking both ways before crossing the street. But this felt profoundly different. The woman wasn't a threat. She was a character who had seemingly walked right off the page, her sorrow a tangible thing that reached across the sterile airport floor and clutched at Maya's small heart. To simply turn away and ignore her felt like closing the book before the happy ending, a quiet betrayal of the story's most important promise. The conflict was a silent storm inside her, the powerful pull of empathy warring with the quiet obedience of a well-behaved child. With a sudden, firm resolve that belied her tender age, Maya slid silently from the slick plastic chair. Her small sneakers made a barely audible squeak against the polished linoleum, a tiny sound completely lost to her father, whose attention remained captive to the mesmerizing digital glow in his palm. She left the storybook of Lost Stars behind on the seat, its colorful cover a final, fleeting glimpse of a world where problems were neatly solved in a few simple pages. Now, she was stepping into the real world, a daunting and chaotic landscape of hurried legs, massive rolling suitcases, and a sea of adult faces that were closed off and distant. But her gaze was fixed, unwavering and clear, on the solitary figure of the woman by the gate, whose silent desperation had become Maya's singular, urgent mission. She moved with a quiet, unshakable determination, a small boat navigating a turbulent sea of indifferent giants who rushed past without a second glance. Each step was deliberate, closing the distance between her own sheltered innocence and the woman's palpable despair. As she drew nearer, she saw the fine, heartbreaking details of Ilara's pain, the faint shimmer of unshed tears that made her eyes look like glass, the way her fingers anxiously twisted the worn fabric of her jacket, and the subtle, defeated sag of her shoulders that spoke of a hope beginning to crumble into dust. This was not an abstract sadness from a story. It was a living, breathing thing. Maya felt a profound, instinctual empathy, a silent understanding that this woman was truly and utterly lost, and that she needed help. Ilara, spiraling in a vortex of silent panic and crushing disappointment, felt a delicate, hesitant touch on her arm. The contact was so light it was almost imaginary, but it was real enough to break through the suffocating isolation that had enveloped her. She lowered her gaze, her tear-filled eyes blinking in surprise to find a small girl standing before her. The child's expression was not one of pity, but of a solemn, almost ancient understanding. Then, the impossible happened. The little girl lifted her own tiny hand and clumsily, yet perfectly, replicated the secret gesture of the lost star, the sign of distress Ilara had shared only with her mother. For Ilara, it was like hearing a beloved voice after a lifetime of silence, a shockwave of recognition and gratitude that momentarily erased everything else. Maya didn't wait for Ilara to process the surreal moment. Her small fingers wrapped around Ilara's wrist with a gentle but confident grip, a silent command to trust her and to follow. She then turned, her big, curious eyes scanning the terminal until they locked onto a uniformed airline official standing at a nearby customer service podium. With a slight, decisive nod, as if confirming a secret plan with herself, Maya began to walk, leading the stunned and disbelieving woman through the throng of travelers. Her father, just a few yards away, scrolled through another social media post, completely oblivious to the extraordinary act of courage and compassion his daughter was performing. Maya was no longer just an observer. She had become the guide, a small child leading a lost soul toward help. The airline official, a man whose name tag read Marcus, looked up from his paperwork with an air of practiced weariness, his face a mask ready to deflect another passenger's frustration. But the sight before him disarmed his professional defenses. He didn't see an angry customer. He saw a small child with an expression of solemn duty, her tiny hand firmly holding the wrist of a woman whose eyes were wide with a mixture of shock, confusion, and a fragile, dawning hope. The chaotic symphony of the airport seemed to mute around them, creating a small, quiet bubble in the middle of the terminal floor. For Ilara, the world had shrunk to the warm, steady pressure of Maya's fingers on her skin. A tiny anchor in a sea of overwhelming silence. It was the first truly human touch she had felt all day, and it grounded her more than she could have ever imagined. Standing before the tall counter, Maya was too small to see over the top, but her purpose was unwavering. She released Ilara's wrist and, with great seriousness, held up her storybook, pointing a determined finger at the illustration of the lost stars. Then she pointed back at Ilara. The connection was abstract, a child's logic, yet Marcus understood it instantly. Ilara, emboldened by the girl's courage, stepped forward, her hands moving in a fluid, desperate dance as she explained her deafness, the missed flight, and the closed gate. Marcus's expression softened completely, the corporate shield dissolving to reveal a man with kind eyes. He nodded slowly, not with pity, but with a genuine understanding, and gestured for them to wait at a set of nearby seats while he began to type A, his fingers moving with a new, gentle urgency. In the relative quiet of the waiting area, a space between one journey's end and another's beginning, the bond between the woman and the child deepened. The shared crisis had melted away, leaving a comfortable, wordless companionship. Ilara reached into her worn backpack and retrieved a creased photograph of her waiting family, her mother's smile radiating warmth even from the faded image. She showed it to Maya, who studied the faces with intense curiosity. The little girl then looked from the picture of Ilara's mother to Ilara's face, and slowly she made the secret gesture of the lost star. It was no longer a signal of distress, but a question of connection. Ilara felt a fresh wave of tears well in her eyes as she nodded, a silent confirmation that this small child had somehow understood the deepest longing of her heart. Maya, in a moment of reciprocal trust, reached into the tiny pocket of her own dress and pulled out a folded piece of paper. She carefully unfolded it to reveal a crayon drawing. It depicted a woman with hair the color of sunshine, standing alone beneath a sky filled with dark, swirling stars. Unlike the hopeful stars in her storybook, these seemed distant and cold. And the woman's face, though simply drawn, was undeniably sad. Maya pointed to the drawing, then tapped her own chest with a quiet, somber gesture. Ilara frowned, trying to decipher the meaning. The drawing held a story of its own, a subtle melancholy that seemed too heavy for such a small child to carry. It was a silent confession of a different kind of loneliness, a small, intriguing crack in the girl's bright, innocent facade. Their quiet moment was interrupted by Marcus's return. In his hand, he held a single, crisp piece of paper, a new boarding pass for a flight leaving in 3 hours. Relief washed over Ilara so powerfully it felt like a physical wave, leaving her weak-kneed and breathless. She knelt and pulled Maya into a fierce, grateful hug that conveyed all the words she could not speak. It was then that a man's voice, laced with mild panic, called out, "Maya!" Her father. His phone finally put away, rushed over, his eyes wide with confusion as he saw his daughter in the arms of a stranger. As he gently pulled her back, Ilara saw Maya look over her father's shoulder and make the lost star gesture one last time, a secret promise that she had been seen and understood. As Maya's father, David, finally pulled his attention away from the digital world, a jolt of pure, primal fear shot through him. He saw his daughter, his entire world, in the arms of a complete stranger, and his mind instantly leapt to the worst possible conclusions. He rushed forward, his voice sharper than he intended as he called her name. Gently but firmly, he separated Maya from Ilara, creating a physical barrier with his own body. He offered Ilara a tight, perfunctory apology, his words clipped and bordering on accusatory, assuming his child had been a nuisance. He didn't see the tear-streaked gratitude on the woman's face or the boarding pass she clutched like an answered prayer. He only saw a potential threat and a disruption. immediately turning to his daughter and beginning a soft but stern lecture about the dangers of wandering off and speaking to people they didn't know, completely oblivious to the profound act of human connection he had just interrupted. Being led away, Maya's small hand felt lost in her father's much larger, tighter grip. She looked back over her shoulder, her heart aching with a strange sense of shared loss as she saw Ilara watching them go. The little girl hadn't just been helping a stranger, she had been helping a kindred spirit. The drawing she had so bravely shared was her most guarded secret, a silent testament to the grief she carried. It was a portrait of her own mother, the woman with sunshine hair who had left 1 year ago, promising to come back from her trip among the stars. Her father never spoke of her, and the house grew quiet with her absence. In Ilara's desperate, silent gesture, Maya had recognized her own unspoken loneliness, the feeling of being a lost star, searching for a light that had gone out, a sorrow too deep for a 6-year-old to name, but one she understood with every fiber of her being. David's distraction was not born of indifference, but of a deep, unhealed wound. This very airport terminal was a ghost, a place haunted by the memory of his last goodbye to Maya's mother, Sarah. She was an artist, a vibrant soul who felt caged by their quiet life, and she had left to chase a dream across the ocean. His constant scrolling wasn't for work or social media. It was a ritual of hollow hope, a desperate, compulsive search for an email or a message from her that never came. He had constructed a fragile narrative for Maya, a fairy tale about her mother exploring the world to shield her from the harsh truth of her abandonment. He was so focused on protecting his daughter from the past that he failed to see how profoundly its shadow was already touching her, shaping her quiet world in ways he couldn't begin to comprehend. He settled Maya back into the hard plastic chair, trying to ground them both in the familiar comfort of her storybook. "Let's stay with the stars in the book, okay?" "Sweetie," he murmured, his voice thick with a strained gentleness. But as he spoke, he noticed the folded crayon drawing lying on the floor where it had fallen. He picked it up, his breath catching in his chest as he unfolded it. He saw it with new eyes now, not just a child's doodle, but a heartbreakingly accurate portrait of Sarah, standing alone under a sky of cold, distant stars. He saw the profound sadness Maya had captured in the simple lines of the woman's face, a sorrow he had refused to acknowledge in his own daughter. The secret he had worked so tirelessly to conceal was not a secret at all. It was a shared burden, expressed in the silent, eloquent language of a child's art. From her seat across the way, Ilara watched the tender, troubled moment between the father and daughter, feeling a pang of empathy for their unspoken story. She turned her attention to the large departure boards, waiting for her new gate to be announced. A news segment began to play on one of the large screens, the bright images catching her eye. A face filled the screen, a beautiful woman with radiant, sunshine-colored hair, her smile both brilliant and familiar. It was the woman from Maya's drawing. Ilara couldn't read the Chiron at the bottom of the screen, but the image was unmistakable. She glanced from the news report to the little girl, and then to the father, who now had his face buried in his hands, completely unaware of the broadcast. But what he didn't know is that his past was not just a painful memory, but a living, breathing person who was, at that very moment, somewhere inside the same airport. A profound and unsettling choice settled upon Ilara, heavy as an anchor. In her hand was the key to her own reunion, a boarding pass that promised the warmth of her mother's embrace and an end to her long, lonely journey. Yet, across the terminal, a different story was shattering. She saw the father's slumped shoulders, the way he clutched his daughter's simple drawing as if it were a sacred relic of a forgotten life. On the giant, glowing screen, the woman with sunshine hair smiled a polished, public smile, oblivious to the quiet devastation her image was causing. To walk away now felt like a betrayal, not just to the little girl who had seen her when no one else would, but to the invisible threads of fate that had so clearly woven their stories together in this transient, impersonal space. Her own journey could wait. This one had to be faced. With a quiet resolve that calmed the trembling in her hands, Elara rose from her seat. Her movement was deliberate, a single, focused action in a sea of chaotic motion. She navigated the river of hurried travelers, her eyes locked on the small, isolated island of grief where David and Maya sat. The polished floor reflected the harsh terminal lights, making her path seem slick and uncertain. David never looked up, his world having shrunk to the size of the crayon drawing in his hands, his face a mask of sorrow so deep it was almost a physical presence. He was completely unaware of her approach, a man adrift in a memory, about to be struck by a tidal wave he could not see coming. Each step Elara took was a beat of suspense, closing the distance between a painful past and a shocking, unavoidable present. She reached him and paused for a fraction of a second, her heart pounding a silent, frantic rhythm against her ribs. Then she gently, hesitantly, placed a hand on his shoulder. The touch was light, but it pierced through the thick fog of his despair. David flinched, looking up with eyes clouded by irritation and confusion, ready to dismiss the stranger who had already caused him such alarm. He saw Elara, but before he could speak, she simply shook her head and lifted a trembling finger, pointing not at him, not at Maya, but towards the massive television screen broadcasting the local news. Her expression was not one of pity, but of urgent, solemn warning. Confused and wary, David followed her gaze, his head turning slowly, reluctantly, toward the silent, flickering images high above the terminal floor. There, 20 feet tall and broadcast in high definition, was the ghost that haunted his every waking moment. It was Sarah. Her hair was styled perfectly, her smile was radiant for the cameras, and a chyron at the bottom of the screen identified her as the celebrated founder of a global tech startup, returning to the city for a major conference. The air rushed from David's lungs, a silent gasp that made no sound. The vibrant, successful woman on the screen was a universe away from the struggling artist who had left E, and an even greater distance from the sad, lonely figure in Maya's drawing. The flimsy piece of paper slipped from his numb fingers, fluttering to the ground like a fallen leaf. The world around him dissolved into a muffled roar as his reality fractured, the carefully constructed story he told himself and his daughter utterly and completely disintegrating. As if summoned from the screen itself, a voice, impossibly familiar and terrifyingly real, cut through the ambient noise of the airport. David, it was not an echo of a memory. It was crisp, clear, and close. He froze, every muscle in his body locking in place. Turning his head felt like moving a mountain, a slow, mechanical pivot toward the source of the sound. And there she was, not a ghost, not a memory, not an image on a screen. Sarah stood less than 15 feet away, flanked by two people in sharp business suits, her expression a complex mixture of shock and uncertainty. The woman who had been a distant, painful star in his daughter's private sky had just fallen to earth, landing directly in the ruins of the life she had abandoned. His world had not just turned upside down, it had ceased to exist. The world tilted on its axis, and for a long moment, the only sound David could hear was the frantic, panicked drumming of his own heart. The polished, successful woman standing before him wore Sarah's face, but she was a stranger. The years of quiet pining, of telling himself she was a struggling artist finding her way, crumbled into dust, replaced by a bitter, humiliating truth. She hadn't been lost. She had been thriving. Every carefully constructed lie he had told his daughter, every lonely night he had spent searching for a sign of her, now felt like a cruel joke he had played on himself. He instinctively tightened his grip on Maya's shoulder, pulling her behind him as if shielding her from a physical threat. His face, once a canvas of shock, hardened into a cold, impenetrable mask of stone. The warmth of memory was flash-frozen by the icy reality of her presence, and a chasm of unspoken betrayal opened between them on the sterile airport floor. Sarah took a hesitant step forward, her own composure beginning to fracture under the weight of his silent, glacial stare. The confident CEO who had just been interviewed on television seemed to vanish, replaced by a woman suddenly stripped of her armor. "David," she repeated, her voice barely a whisper, a fragile plea that was swallowed by the terminal's indifferent hum. She saw the man she had left, but his eyes held no recognition, only a deep, wounded pride that was more formidable than any wall. To him, her success was not a triumph to be celebrated, but a testament to her abandonment. He saw her expensive suit, her polished demeanor, and the entourage that flanked her, and it all screamed one devastating message. She had built this new, glittering life on the ashes of the one they were supposed to have together. He didn't see a person, he saw a judgment, caught in the crossfire of silent, warring emotions. Maya peeked out from behind her father's legs. This was the woman from her drawing, the mother from her secret daydreams, made real and tangible. She didn't comprehend the years of pain, the complex adult grief that had just erupted without a single word being shouted. She only saw the sad eyes that mirrored the ones she had drawn with her crayons. With the pure, uncomplicated instinct of a child, she reached out a small, trembling hand, a silent offering of connection, a bridge across the chasm. But David, seeing the gesture from the corner of his eye, gently but firmly took her hand and pulled it back to her side. It was a gesture of protection, but it was also a definitive act of rejection, severing the one innocent connection that could have begun to heal them. From her vantage point just a few feet away, Ilara watched the heartbreaking scene play out like a silent film. Its emotional volume turned to the maximum. She, who had only wanted to mend a small, temporary separation, now felt like the catalyst for a much deeper, more permanent one. She had inadvertently reopened a wound she never knew existed, exposing a raw nerve of betrayal and long-buried sorrow. The father's rigid posture, the mother's crumbling facade, and the child's bewildered hope painted a portrait of a family shattered by a past that had just violently collided with the present. Ilara felt a profound ache of empathy, a sense that her own journey to reunion had become tangled in the threads of this family's tragic unraveling. She was no longer just a bystander. She was a witness to a beautiful, fragile hope being extinguished by the cold weight of pride. Sarah's business associate cleared his throat, a subtle, impatient reminder of schedules and obligations that now seemed absurdly trivial. The sound broke the spell. David saw the glance Sarah gave her colleague, and in that fleeting moment, he saw her choice being made all over again. She belonged to that world now, a world of appointments and success, a world where he and Maya no longer fit. Without another word, without a single backward glance, he knelt, scooped his daughter into his arms, and turned away. He walked with a stiff, determined stride, melting into the anonymous river of travelers, leaving Sarah standing alone under the harsh, fluorescent lights. She watched them go, her hand half raised in a gesture she never completed, a monument of success who had just lost everything all over again. The chasm between them now seemed impossibly, devastatingly wide. Left alone in the vast, echoing space, Sarah's world collapsed into a pinpoint of unbearable silence, a vacuum more profound than any Ilara had ever known. The polished facade of the successful CEO shattered, leaving behind only the ghost of a mother who had made an impossible choice years ago. She saw the ghost of her daughter being carried away, a future vanishing before her very eyes. It was in this moment of absolute desolation that Ilara, instead of walking toward her own gate and the promise of family, turned back. She felt an undeniable pull, a sense of responsibility for the wound she had inadvertently torn open. She understood the pain of being unseen, of having a heart full of words that no one could hear, and so she walked toward the woman who had lost everything, choosing empathy over her own long-awaited destination. As Ilara approached, Sarah looked up, her eyes glazed with a defensive sheen, bracing for either pity or judgment from this stranger who had witnessed her utter humiliation. But Ilara offered neither. She simply met Sarah's gaze and, with a slow, deliberate movement, raised her hand and made the secret gesture of the lost star. She then pointed gently in the direction that David and Maya had disappeared. The simple, silent communication sliced through Sarah's wall of shock and despair. It was a message that transcended language, a sign that said, "I see your daughter's heart. I understand her loneliness. She is still looking for you." For the first time all day, Sarah felt truly seen, not as a corporate icon or a failed mother, but as a person connected by a thread of shared, silent sorrow. Meanwhile, David's stride was fueled by a righteous, white-hot anger, each step carrying him further away from the past he had just collided with. But in his arms, Maya was not a passive passenger. She was a tiny, desperate beacon. She squirmed, her small face streaked with tears, her eyes fixed on the receding figure of her mother. Over and over, she made the lost star gesture, her tiny hand a frantic, pleading signal against her father's rigid back. Her silent, persistent cry for connection began to chip away at the fortress of his pride. He finally faltered, his pace slowing to a stop. He looked down at his daughter's heartbroken expression and saw his own pain reflected back at him, multiplied. In his effort to shield her from a past hurt, he was actively inflicting a new one, silencing her heart just as he felt his had been silenced. The realization crashed over him. A wave of shame so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. His pride hadn't been a shield, it had been a cage, locking both him and Maya in a lonely prison of unspoken grief. He had condemned Sarah without a trial, judging her success as a final act of betrayal rather than seeing the lonely woman behind it. He slowly, heavily turned around. The airport's chaotic noise seemed to fade into a distant hum. Across the concourse, he saw Sarah, no longer a powerful CEO but a solitary figure, frozen in regret. Standing beside her, like a quiet guardian, was Ilara, the deaf woman he had so callously misjudged. Her gaze met his, not with accusation, but with a deep, compassionate understanding that offered a path he thought was lost forever, the path toward forgiveness. He walked back, each step an apology, a dismantling of the wall he had built around his heart. When he reached them, he gently set Maya on the floor. Without a moment's hesitation, the little girl ran, a blur of motion and hope, and launched herself into her mother's arms. Sarah collapsed to her knees, clutching her daughter as if she were a lifeline, her controlled composure finally breaking in a wave of raw, cathartic sobs. David watched them, his own eyes filling with tears. He then looked at Ilara, the silent catalyst for this impossible reunion. He mouthed the words, "Clumsy and inadequate." "Thank you." Ilara simply smiled, a gentle, knowing expression that conveyed a universe of understanding. In the heart of the impersonal terminal, amidst the rush of strangers, a family began the slow, delicate work of piecing itself back together, their healing guided by the quiet courage of a child and the profound empathy of a woman who listened with her heart. Weeks later, the sterile chaos of the airport terminal was replaced by the gentle murmur of a city park at dusk. The setting sun cast long, golden shadows across the grass, painting the world in hues of forgiveness and peace. David and Sarah sat on a blanket, not perfectly mended, but present, their shoulders almost touching as they watched Maya chase fireflies. Between them lay a small, open book on sign language, a testament to a new language of effort and understanding they were learning together. Nearby, Ilara sat on a bench, a soft smile on her face as she watched the scene unfold. She was no longer a stranger caught in a moment of crisis. but a cherished friend, a quiet godmother to this fragile, beautiful reunion she had helped orchestrate. The world after the storm was not loud or triumphant. It was soft, tentative, and filled with the profound grace of a second chance. Ilara had eventually made it home. Her own reunion with her mother made all the sweeter by the journey she had taken through another family's heart. She learned a lesson that day that no departure board could ever teach her. Sometimes, what feels like a devastating delay is merely the universe guiding you to the path you were always meant to walk. Her missed flight was not a closed door, but an opening into a deeper understanding of human connection. She had spent a lifetime feeling unheard, only to discover that the most powerful communication requires no sound at all. It is seen in a child's unwavering gaze, felt in a stranger's gentle touch, and understood in a shared gesture that means you are not alone. She had come to the airport seeking her own family, and had left having helped create a new one. The healing for David and Sarah was a slow, deliberate process, built one quiet conversation at a time. They spoke of the years of silence, of the ambition that had driven Sarah away, and the pride that had kept David from reaching out. They unearthed the pain they had both carried, not as weapons to wound each other further, but as artifacts to be examined, understood, and finally laid to rest. Maya was their constant anchor to the present, her unconditional love, a powerful antidote to the bitterness of the past. The crayon drawing of the lonely woman under the stars was now framed on Maya's nightstand, no longer a symbol of loss, but a reminder that even the most distant stars can find their way home when guided by a light bright enough to show them the way. In a world that rushes past, filled with the constant roar of its own importance, it is easy to become deaf to the silent stories unfolding around us every single day. We are all travelers in our own bustling terminals, distracted by our destinations, often forgetting to look at the faces of those who share the journey. But this story is a quiet reminder that the most important messages are not always spoken aloud. They are seen by hearts that are willing to pay attention. It is a testament to the fact that a single moment of pure empathy can change the trajectory of a life, or even a generation. If this story touched you and reminded you of the profound power of truly seeing someone, consider sharing it, for it may be the light someone needs to see their own way home. As the last sliver of sun dipped below the horizon, bathing the park in a soft, lavender twilight, Maya ran back to the blanket. She looked from her mother's face to her father's, then turned her gaze to Ilara on the bench. With a solemn sweetness, she lifted her small hand and made the gesture of the lost star. It was no longer a cry of distress or a secret code of loneliness. It was a statement, a declaration of gratitude, a sign that meant found. Ilara smiled, her heart full, and signed back a simple, beautiful message that shimmered in the fading light. "You are the light." David reached over and took Sarah's hand, their fingers intertwining in a silent promise of a new beginning, their shared gaze reflecting the quiet, resilient hope of a family who had finally learned to listen to the silence.